This is the King Chasing Podcast, where we keep Christ at the center of athletics. Here's your host, Brandon Gilmore.
Welcome back to the show, everyone. I'm Brandon, and this is the King Chasing Podcast. As always, thanks for joining us, and please make sure to visit our website at theNCCAA.org for more King Chasing content. Today's guest is Ben Bost, the founder and primary speaker of AIM Awareness, whose passion is helping people live meaning-filled lives. For over a decade, Ben has mentored world-class professional athletes and business leaders, guiding them through personal and professional issues. He brings a deep, creative, aesthetic, and philosophical approach to every engagement that assists organizations with how to practically adapt to our rapidly changing mental health landscape. Thanks for listening today, and I hope you enjoy my conversation with Ben. Well, hey, Ben, welcome to King Chasing. How are you today, sir?
Doing great, Brandon. Pleasure to be here with you.
Yeah, we're excited to have you on today as a mental health expert, with it being May, Mental Health Month. So if you can start just sharing how you became so passionate about mental health.
That's right. It is. It's Mental Health Awareness Month in May. You think I would know that as stating expert? You're using that terminology very liberally here. But how I became passionate about mental health is, I guess, the easiest answer would be my own lived experience and story as an athlete, as a competitive athlete, and really struggling myself in college as a D1 college golfer at UCLA and Baylor, and then for 7 years professionally, and not really knowing what was happening to me during that time and the struggles that I was facing as an athlete. And then years later, through a series of events, I mean, this is the kind of work that you don't go looking for, right? It kind of finds you. And that's really what happened to me. I've said to people on a regular basis, I'd be okay if I didn't have to talk about stress, anxiety, or suicide or depression ever again. I really would be okay with that.
Yeah.
But my passion comes from lived experience, and then being out in the world and engaging with athletes and students, student athletes, and environments, and just seeing the crisis that we're facing, the widespread crisis that we're facing across culture, and then tying back to like I said, my lived experience and story as an athlete.
How would you describe the mental health crisis you just mentioned that's sweeping across Western society?
Well, we've seen dramatic increases really from 2007 till now in very interesting demographics. One in particular is the percentage of completed suicide among young females, ages 15 to 24. It's not a particular demographic that we would see in the past, but that has certainly changed. So that's a marker that is interesting to be aware of, to ask questions like, what is happening with that demographic? Last spring, and I just saw a new article about this that came out end of last year, about I think it was 4 or 5 Division I athletes who were all female that died by suicide in the spring of 2022.
Yeah.
And so when you see dynamics like that going on, it forces you to have to ask some other questions. So there's that, the increase of non-suicidal self-harm, or as people would say, cutting, and dynamics like that showing up. But it's very much living in the younger populations. And my focus for years was on the increase of depression, these particular increases in suicide. And I was very intentionally researching that for quite some time. And then earlier this year, everything shifted. And there was an answer that I think has come, which is what we're really seeing upstream as I believe the cause is, which is stress and burnout. If you know anything about stress and burnout and its progression and the markers of that progression, I'll go through them very quickly. Physical, mental, emotional exhaustion over a long period of time that leads to dissatisfaction. Then starts to misalign with core values, which is very, very critical for people to understand. Athletes don't get into sport because they hate it. there's an aspect that they love it. And there's a value inside of them that's driving. And as that starts to misalign, there's a dissatisfaction that sets in. If there's difficult coaching dynamics, potentially a cynicism, difficult team dynamics, those start to show up, and then motivation starts to plummet. It's very hard to motivate an athlete when they're in that progression. And ultimately, if it goes the distance, it's a loss of identity. I now no longer know why I'm doing what I'm doing. And if that happens, there's a line at that point where in that space I just described is hypervigilance. People deal with a lot of anxiety, a lot of stress. They're trying to be up for it, make it happen. But then eventually it gives out. The body gives out, the mind gives out, and you go into hypovigilance, and that's when depression sets in and people are at risk for suicide. Most of our stress and burnout research and focus has been in the medical world on physicians, particularly through COVID, and then also a lot of it in the corporate sector. But we haven't been talking about athletes, and we definitely have not been talking about the next generation and just general student populations as a whole. I've been a contracted mental health and wellness consultant for a school district the last year. And when I've been in classrooms and looking at students, you can see it. They're exhausted. And culture to them and living today is overwhelming. The single word that I hear a lot that they use is pressure. They feel pressure and they don't know how to describe where it's coming from.
Are there certain factors that have led to the crisis? I know you mentioned stress and burnout just now, but is there anything else, or do we just live in a time where there's more awareness and the crisis has always been there, but it's just been hidden until now?
So that's a great question. It's a multi-layered answer that I may not have enough time to get into all details about that. Some people will take the position that just with information and access to it, we have a lot more awareness of what's going on in our culture and society, and that this has always been present. I would say that is potentially a little short-sighted, and the reasons for that is what has changed. Like when you look at the onset of in 2007, the rise of the smartphone and all the dynamics and the massive amounts of information that is rushing at people now, there's no human that can actually disseminate and process through everything that's coming at us in a moment's notice that you're having to make snap decisions on. So we are inundated and overwhelmed with information and the speed at which culture is functioning. That's the first part. Culture didn't function like this in previous history. But I often get cornered and asked the question, people say like, so what do you think is causing it? And I would say it's predominantly environmental. And the way I would phrase it is that it's competitive individualism with no meaning and morality. We have a hyper-competitive society full of pressure and speed, and more than any other point in history, as far as having anchoring aspects of life, which I was referencing with meaning and morality, those things are absent for a lot of people. So now you have this environment that is hyper-competitive. And what do you have beneath that to supply meaning and stability and anchoring for your life, for you to go out into the world and live in that? Brandon, you and I both know you can talk to yourself in the kindest ways possible philosophically about how to live life and that everybody's going to be kind and nice. And then you get in the real world. And the fact is, reality has no mercy. And you get in the world and it's competitive, it's cutthroat. Not everywhere, but that's just the truth. And people are scratching and clawing to make their space in the world. And it's sometimes for them, it's the only thing they have. There's added aspects, and I'll talk about 4 categories here in a second. But think about it like this: club sports and youth sports, it's $1 billion industry. When we talk about the 4 layers of the environment that are causing this, in my opinion, first is economic. There's a lot of money to be made in competitive sport, and particularly in youth sports. And I won't go into all the details on that. But the next generation of athletes feel this. Coaches feel it, right? It's kind of funny. When does it disappear for the kids? I don't know, 7 years old, right? They go out and go on the field and you say, little Johnny, go out and have fun, right? Everyone tells them to go out and have fun, and they're running around playing soccer or whatever. And then they look at the sidelines and the parents are screaming and the coaches are screaming. And it's like, at that moment, they're like, this is not about fun anymore.
Right.
So like, when does that actually set in is interesting. It's hard to identify. right? But there's an economic piece that's driving a lot of this. Second would be academic. For student athletes, it is impossible to keep a student athlete schedule and an academic schedule. That's two full-time jobs. My burnout that I experienced at UCLA as a Division I golfer included both of those dynamics. It was at the end of playing 2 tournaments in 8 days, 144 holes, and then returning back to UCLA and having 3 papers due.
Wow.
And someone would say, well, you should have been doing your papers on the road. You try doing that when you're exhausted, right?
Yeah.
You know, so what's expected out of athletes a lot of times, and even students, is quite ridiculous. The consumeristic aspect of this competition goes back even to club sports and youth sports. That really is, there's a lot of money to be made, but it's all kind of functioning under this this dynamic of capitalism. Here's the thing, I'm not a socialist, I'm not against capitalism, but we have some interesting dynamics that are challenging. And the last one would be social. There's social competitiveness now with social media and gaming that has created a dynamic in people's lives that is challenging. So we have to look at the multi-layered pieces, but the widespread reality of it, to me, from my perspective, is environmental. There's been environmental changes that people are not functioning well and don't necessarily know how to describe in their life.
For any coaches who may be listening and don't think that they have any student athletes who are dealing with mental health challenges, what are some signs that they should look for?
Well, I'll address the first piece. Don't think that they have them. I mean, if we just go statistically to the last data we have from the NCAA, is that 1 in 4 Division I athletes were dealing with depression.
Wow.
So that's of reporting athletes.
Right.
So I just think we need to take a position of learning to understand what's actually happening for the athletes. The second part of your question, can you repeat that part? I wanted to address the first part.
Just some signs that they can look out for to see if they have student athletes dealing with it.
So signs, let's talk about performance first, right? Stress and anxiety are actually good things. We're built for them. It's too much stress and too much anxiety that's not helpful. And so there's the performance bell curve, and many people who are in coaching probably have heard of the performance bell curve. And what this is basically as stress and anxiety increases, performance increases. We need it for us to be at our best. The problem is when it crests the top of the bell curve and there's too much, then performance decreases. So we have to be aware of too much increased stress and anxiety from a coaching standpoint when we are watching our athletes. If we start to see decrease in their performance over a period of time, we can ask some questions. Low motivation would be another one. When we go back to that progression of burnout, we need to be looking at those markers, in my opinion. Exhaustion, physical, mental, emotional exhaustion over a long period of time, and then decrease in motivation. If athletes are hard to motivate, that might be telling you that they're under immense amounts of stress and potentially on a progression of burnout. And if they're willing and actually talking, a lot of times when athletes are struggling, and this is what I've seen in athletic departments, is your athletic trainers are becoming therapists and they're not trained for that. And even student academic counselors, athletic counselors, anybody someone can talk to is now fielding information about the struggles that athletes are facing.
Right.
Because when they're struggling, they will talk to anyone. And that's why we need to be prepared as a whole to be able to handle these issues. But as a coach, it's really looking at the markers for stress and burnout and how to weave into your coaching plan and process ways to help them calibrate their stress and anxiety into good spaces so that it's not running out of control. Because they come into the environment with higher levels of stress and anxiety today than maybe in the past.
What are some common mistakes that people make when trying to help someone dealing with mental health challenges?
That's a great question. Common mistakes that I see would be probably the biggest one is pretending it's not there. And I think that couldn't be understated or overstated, I guess is the better term, is just turning a blind eye and pretending it's not there. The fact is, it is there. And if you have a team of 20, 25 athletes, there's a few that are dealing with the challenges, and it ebbs and flows in people's lives. There are certain personality types that it affects more. And this is where I would go to if you are interested. Not educating yourself would be another mistake. But we're also working to put out more and more details to help coaches educate themselves on what to be looking for, particularly in our organization. But not educating yourself on what might be present and happening in the world around you. So those would be the two most common details. And then that education process would be protocols, how to address a situation when you see it.
What are some strategies for leaders or coaches who are working with someone who's struggling to help them overcome?
So I'll go really to the first major one that causes people to ask questions would be someone who's actively suicidal, right? If you're facing a situation where someone is either having ideation, step further. If you've inquired with them, are you thinking of taking your life? Which one of the questions people fear asking that question. All of the data tells us you need to ask that question. And a lot of times it brings comfort to the person. They go, oh, I'm like, someone's actually interested in what's going on inside of me. If they have a plan or are actively suicidal, you do everything you can to get them help as quickly as possible. You call services, 911, you get someone there, you get them to the hospital, the emergency room as quickly as you can, right? That is a very important first wave of protocol for doing that. As far as dealing with someone over a period of time and watching them, recommending things like getting them help and therapy, right amounts of rest is very helpful. Dealing with situations like panic, this would be another one, panic attacks. I hear this a lot with people who struggle with these environments and that they might have panic attacks from time to time. Knowing what to do to get someone into a settled position to help them to be able to calm down. They're going to have to ride it out for 10 minutes and even potentially a recovery time of an hour. But being able to notice that and be able to get them in a situation to help them to find a place of calm, right? Versus just trying to push them to keep going.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really common mistake is to coach them harder. And if we just coach them harder, they'll push through it. And the reality is, I think as coaches today, we have to evaluate our own coaching styles as to if there are actual dynamics we create that are more stress and anxiety provoking.
How important is it for mental health education and strategies to include a biblical foundation?
So when we look at the basis of all of it, if you remember what I said earlier, competitive individualism with no meaning and morality. One of the greatest and most stabilizing things that we can have in our life is a deep sense of meaning. The holistic plan that the scriptures give us for our development and maturity as followers of Jesus is critical in providing that to the point in which it's actually integrated in a person's life. To be fair, when I struggled with suicidal ideation, I was a passionate follower of Jesus. Right. So, but what I would tell you is one of the most major things in my life at that time that helped me with the challenge and struggle was my faith and the ways in which we understand that. We couldn't go far enough in doubling down on helping create frameworks and structures for those around us, the athletes that we care for, and giving them structure for their holistic health and as an athlete that is biblical and being able to do that. I would say when it's able to be deployed into the lives of your athletes, it is one of the most stabilizing and anchoring pieces that can be available.
Is there anything else specific you'd like to share before we let you go?
Well, what I'm really excited about is last June I was with the NCCAA family and presented on this issue. And then after that, there were multiple people who thought it would be a good idea to try to have me come to their campuses. I went to one and realized like this is not going to be the solution and it's not sustainable. Though it was flattering to be asked to go there. And I called Dan and said, I'm interested in seeing culture change. And so we undertook a process to develop a culture shaping approach for athletic departments and resourcing for athletes that we will be revealing in June and will be available in August to these universities. So we've gone basically from October until August, less than a year, to deploy a solution that we're very, very excited about that I will reveal at the convention in June.
That's awesome. That's exciting. We look forward
to
yeah, we look forward to hearing about that at convention. Well, that's all the time we have. But thank you, Ben, for joining us on King Chasing today.
Thanks, Brandon. Appreciate it.
Thanks again to Ben for sharing about the mental health crisis in Western society, strategies for overcoming mental health challenges, and the importance of a biblical foundation for mental health education. If you haven't yet, please subscribe to the King Chasing podcast on whatever app you use to listen. We would also appreciate it if you encouraged others to listen and subscribe. Once again, we're thankful to you for tuning in and supporting us. Join us next time on King Chasing. Take care, everyone.